Okay, so, this time around, you've really given us something interesting to unpack.
Yeah.
It's not every day we find ourselves trying to connect like ancient biblical texts and what's happening, in the legal battles in Brazil right now.
It's uh, it's an interesting combination for sure.
On the surface, they seem worlds apart. But I
Yeah.
think as we've started digging into the material, you provided some fascinating connections are starting to emerge.
Absolutely. And the material you provided is really rich. We're
Yeah.
looking at these YouTube transcripts and articles that explore the biblical origins of African peoples.
Yeah.
And then we're diving into analyses of the legal controversies surrounding the January 8th events in Brazil and the actions of the Supreme Federal Court,
Right. The STF.
the STF. Yeah, it's a compelling pairing.
It really is. So
Yeah.
for you, our listener, our mission today is to unpack these two seemingly distinct areas.
Right.
We want to extract the key insights and maybe the surprising facts and even hint at some unexpected ways these historical narratives and contemporary events might be linked.
And how they shape our understanding of the world.
Absolutely.
So tell me a little bit about the types of sources we have to work with today.
Yeah, so the variety of sources is excellent. We have the Legado de Santidad YouTube transcript, which offers a particular perspective on biblical history.
Okay.
And then we have articles and other YouTube transcripts from channels like Etatia, Te Actualize, and Ana Paula Henkel, giving us diverse viewpoints on the Brazilian political and judicial landscape.
Okay, great. So let's kind of dive in and start with this biblical perspective on the origins of African peoples.
Okay.
Because I think when you really look into it, it might challenge some assumptions that people commonly hold.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is that the Bible does indeed acknowledge a significant presence of African individuals and nations right from its earliest accounts. So think about the book of Genesis,
Okay.
chapter 10. It outlines the descendants of Noah after the flood, and one of his sons, Ham, is presented as a key ancestor for various African peoples.
And Ham had several sons, right?
That's right.
Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Those are the names that come up.
Those are the names.
And it seems like Cush is really central when we talk about the origins of many African nations according to this biblical view.
Precisely. The descendants of Cush are described as populating territories that much later became known as Ethiopia, Sudan, and the surrounding regions.
Right.
So right there in Genesis, the Bible is establishing this deep historical connection to Africa. And what's particularly striking is this early placement and significance of these lineages within the broader human story as told by the Bible.
Yeah. And then you have Nimrod, who is a descendant of Cush, and he's described as this, first mighty man on earth, and even credited with building kingdoms like Babel.
Right.
That's a pretty significant figure to have these ancestral roots, according to this biblical perspective.
It is.
It's really kind of puts a different spin on how we might typically think about these ancient narratives.
It certainly does. It challenges any notion that Africa or its peoples are somehow absent or marginal in the foundational biblical narrative.
And what's also crucial to understand, and perhaps surprising to some, is the biblical perspective on race and skin color.
Which I think is fundamentally different from how we often categorize people today.
Absolutely. The Bible really emphasizes a unified human race originating from Adam and Eve. As it says in Acts 17:26, God made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth. The diversity of ethnicities and, yes, skin colors is presented as arising later, after events like the Tower of Babel, where languages were confused and people dispersed.
Right.
So the Bible doesn't distinguish based on skin color in that primarily foundational sense.
That's a really important distinction.
It is.
So beyond Cush and Nimrod, are there any other figures from the African continent that make an appearance in the Bible that might be noteworthy?
Well, we see several compelling figures. The Queen of Sheba's visit to King Solomon is a classic example highlighting diplomatic and economic interactions between ancient Israel and African royalty.
Yeah.
The Bible also mentions Cushites, or Ethiopians, interacting with Israel at various points, sometimes in conflict, sometimes in other ways. And then there's Taraca, a Cushite pharaoh of Egypt in the 8th century BCE.
Okay.
He's mentioned in 2 Kings for his involvement in a conflict that threatened Jerusalem, a significant African leader playing a crucial role in biblical history. It makes you wonder, how many people today are aware of his impact on these ancient events?
That's fascinating. I had no idea about Taraca's role in that particular conflict.
Yeah.
What about the New Testament? Does this thread of African presence continue in the early Christian story?
It absolutely does. A key figure is the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8.
Right.
He was a high-ranking official, essentially the treasurer for Queen Candace of Ethiopia, and he's depicted as an early Gentile convert to Christianity. His story is really significant because it illustrates the early expansion of Christianity beyond its initial Jewish followers, to include people from Africa. It shows a deliberate reaching out and inclusion.
And then you have Simeon Niger in Acts 13.1. Niger, literally meaning black, right?
That's right.
So we're talking about an African leader holding a position of influence in the early church in Antioch.
Exactly. And it underscores the diversity of the early Christian movement and the inclusion of African leadership right from the start. And throughout the Bible, there's this recurring theme of universal salvation and God's inclusion of all nations.
Right.
Verses like Acts 10.34-35, where Peter declares that God shows no partiality, but in every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him, really drive this point home. Even in the Exodus story, Exodus 12.38 mentions a mixed multitude, leaving Egypt with the Israelites, suggesting the inclusion of Egyptians and potentially other African peoples in that foundational event of the Old Testament.
So when we piece all of this together, what's the bigger takeaway? Why should someone today take note of this consistent presence of African peoples throughout the Bible?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, recognizing the deep historical roots of African peoples within the biblical narrative can have a really profound impact.
Yeah.
For people of African descent today, it can offer a stronger sense of connection to these foundational religious texts, showing that their history and heritage are interwoven from the very beginning. It challenges any attempts to marginalize or erase their presence from these important historical and spiritual narratives, offering a powerful counter-narrative. It makes you think about how historical understanding shapes contemporary identity.
Okay, so that's really interesting, and I think we've explored this perhaps less familiar aspect of biblical history.
Yeah.
Now let's shift gears a little bit and dive into the second part of our discussion, the legal and political landscape in Brazil, specifically focusing on the January 8th events and the Supreme Federal Court, or the STF.
Right.
You sent a YouTube transcript of a lawyer defending Augusto Heleno,
Right.
along with various analyses of the STF's actions. So this feels like a completely different world, doesn't it?
It might seem that way initially,
Yeah.
but what's fascinating is how legal narratives and interpretations of events can also shape a sense of belonging and justice within a nation, much like historical and religious narratives do. So let's start with the defense of Augusto Heleno.
Okay.
He's facing indictment for alleged involvement in a coup attempt, and his lawyer, Mateus Mir Melanis, presents a very specific set of arguments against these charges.
Right. One of the first points the lawyer makes is this objection to the splitting of the legal process.
Yeah.
Why is that a concern for the defense in this context?
The lawyer argues that the underlying facts related to the accusations against different individuals are essentially the same.
Okay.
By splitting the legal process into multiple proceedings, there's a significant risk of contradictory rulings. Imagine one court finding a particular event happened a certain way, while another court looking at the same core evidence concludes the opposite.
Right.
This could lead to unfair outcomes where individuals are judged based on inconsistent factual findings.
That makes sense.
It raises questions about the coherence and fairness of the overall legal process.
Yeah. He also places a strong emphasis on the defense needing full access to the raw evidence, not just the police report summarizing that evidence.
That's right.
What's the crucial difference he's highlighting there?
He's essentially saying that the police reports are interpretations of the evidence by law enforcement to build a proper defense. They need to examine the original data, the actual pen, drives, phone records, documents, and agendas that were seized.
Okay.
Without that direct access, they're forced to argue their case based on someone else's analysis, which they contend isn't sufficient for a fair trial. It's about ensuring transparency and the ability for the defense to independently verify the evidence.
And what are the specific arguments the defense uses to try and get the charges against Heleno dismissed altogether?
Well, he raises several key points. One involves Heleno's silent presence during a 2021 live broadcast with Bolsonaro.
Okay.
The lawyer argues that simply being present and not saying anything cannot be construed as participating in a coup plot. Another crucial argument revolves around some notes found in an agenda. The defense contends there's no concrete proof that these notes were actually adopted or acted upon by any organized group intending to subvert democracy. They also downplay the supposed similarity, the perfect synchrony between Heleno's alleged notes and material found with Alexander Ramajam, stating it amounts to just a single similar line in separate documents.
Right.
The lawyer even uses a rather vivid analogy comparing the prosecution's attempt to link HELENO to a coup based on this evidence to argumentative flat earthism, trying to force a narrative onto limited and potentially unrelated information.
Yeah, and he also points to evidence that he believes actually clears HELENO of any wrongdoing, doesn't he?
He does. He emphasizes that HELENO'S phone records showed no incriminating communication. Key witnesses in the investigation did not implicate him.
Okay.
He oversaw a peaceful transfer of power to President Lula after the election. He made no public statements supporting the protesters' encampments, and he publicly acknowledged the election results. He also relies heavily on the plea bargain testimony of Mauro Cid, a former aide to Bolsonaro, who reportedly stated he never witnessed any operational planning for a coup involving HELENO. These points aim to paint a picture of HELENO acting within the bounds of his official duties and acknowledging the democratic process.
So the defense is arguing that the case against HELENO is weak and based on flimsy evidence while ignoring factors that suggest his innocence.
Right.
Now let's turn to the broader criticisms being leveled against the STF that you mentioned.
Okay.
These seem to come from various sources, including those Teatrualizai and Anna Paula Henkel YouTube transcripts, as well as some of the articles we looked at.
Yeah.
What are the main concerns being raised about the STF's actions in this period?
Well, this raises some really significant questions about the perceived role and motivations of the STF. One recurring criticism involves the Picadinhas investigation against Bolsonaro, the one concerning alleged falsification of vaccination records. There's a perception that this investigation was abruptly dropped shortly after Mauro Cid's plea deal, which included information about the alleged coup attempt, was approved. This sequence of events has led some to question whether the vaccination record inquiry was primarily a tool to exert pressure on Cid to provide information related to the coup allegations. It highlights a concern about the potential use of investigations for strategic purposes.
And there's also been a shift in how the gifts received by the president are being viewed, hasn't there?
There has initially Brazil's Federal Court of Accounts. The TCU considered gifts received by the president during his term to be public property. This formed the basis for accusations of peculato, a form of embezzlement against Bolsonaro.
Right.
However, the TCU itself later revised this understanding, stating that personal gifts received by president are not public assets. This change significantly weakens the legal foundation for the peculato charges related to these gifts. Despite this, there are reports that the Prosecutor General's office, the PGR, might still pursue charges related to some of the more valuable gifts, like the jewelry potentially creating a conflict with the TCU's revised ruling. This situation underscores the complexities and sometimes conflicting interpretations within the Brazilian legal system.
So we're seeing these accusations of political motivation influencing some of these legal proceedings. What specifically contributes to this perception that the STF might be acting with a political agenda?
Several factors contribute to this perception. There's the suggestion voiced by some analysts that the STF's actions are aimed at preventing Bolsonaro from being eligible to run in the 2026 elections. The timing of certain investigations and judicial decisions has fueled the suspicion in the eyes of his supporters and some observers. Additionally, there's a criticism regarding the apparent inconsistency of seemingly relying on Mauro Cid's testimony as credible evidence in the coup investigation, while then dismissing the Picadinhas case, which also depended on his statements due to a lack of sufficient evidence. This selective application of evidence, as it appears to some, raises questions about the impartiality of the proceedings.
The sources also mention concerns about the severity of the convictions for individuals involved in the January 8th events and this growing feeling of apprehension regarding the boundaries of free speech online in Brazil.
Yeah, there's a significant segment of public opinion that believes the sentences handed down to those involved in the January 8th events have been disproportionately harsh. Coupled with this, there's a growing concern about the potential repercussions for expressing certain political views online, with investigations and legal actions creating a chilling effect on free speech for some base of Dagan. This situation has even garnered international attention, with figures like Elon Musk and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights reportedly expressing their concerns about the scope and impact of these measures.
You mentioned the cases of Deborah and the elderly prisoner. How do their situations tie into this broader discussion?
These cases are often cited as examples of how public pressure and media attention can seemingly influence the STF's decisions. Deborah, who was imprisoned for a considerable period in connection with the January 8th events, and an elderly prisoner suffering from advanced cancer, were both released after significant public outcry and media coverage. This has led to questions about why their releases didn't occur sooner if they were legally warranted, suggesting a potential responsiveness to public opinion rather than strictly adherence to legal timelines.
And there are allegations being made about the use of investigations as a form of political leverage.
It's been alleged that ongoing investigations against certain political figures, such as Gilberto Kassab, are being used as a means to exert pressure on them regarding the issue of amnesty for those detained after January 8th. Furthermore, there are reports of concerns within the political establishment, as highlighted by journalist Natuzza Neri, about potential retaliatory investigations into parliamentary amendments if certain political factions don't align with the STF's perceived interests. These allegations raise serious concerns about the separation of powers and the potential use of legal processes for political ends rather than strictly for upholding the law. The political climate seems quite tense, especially with the incident involving Congressman Marcel Van Hatten.
That's right. Congressman Van Hatten publicly voiced strong criticism of the STF. In response, there are reports that STF members are considering significant repercussions for him, potentially even actions that could lead to the loss of his mandate as a congressman. This has ignited a debate about the limits of free speech for elected officials and the delicate balance of power between the legislative and judicial branches in Brazil. And what was the perspective offered by the article in O Globo that you referenced?
The article in O Globo raised questions about the STF's overall political strategy regarding the possibility of amnesty for those involved in the January 8th events. It suggested that a significant portion of the public may not be convinced that those events truly constituted a full-fledged coup attempt, with many viewing it more as a large-scale act of vandalism. This lack of widespread public consensus on the severity of the events, the article argued, could ultimately undermine the legitimacy of very harsh punishments and potentially increase public support for a broad amnesty in the future, regardless of the STF's current stance.
You also mentioned Minister Barroso's statement about the urgency of judging Bolsonaro in 2024.
I did.
What are the potential implications of that timeline?
Minister Barroso publicly stated that it would be ideal to have any judicial proceedings against Bolsonaro concluded before the 2026 election year. This has been interpreted by some as a politically motivated timeline, suggesting an intention to potentially disqualify Bolsonaro from running in the next election cycle through legal means before the electoral process fully begins. It raises questions about the timing of judicial actions and their potential influence on the political landscape.
And finally, there's the perspective that the STF's intense focus on identifying and addressing extremist right-wing elements online might be an oversimplification or misdiagnosis of the more complex issues facing Brazil.
Yeah, that's a sentiment that surfaces in some of the analyses.
Yeah.
The argument is that by primarily focusing on one segment of the political spectrum online, the STF might be overlooking other significant underlying social and political factors contributing to the current situation in Brazil. It suggests a need for a more comprehensive understanding of the various dynamics at play.
The last point in this section of our outline touches on the STF's jurisdiction, its legal authority to try individuals without special legal standing in cases related to the January 8th events. This brings up the important legal principle of the natural judge. Could you explain that a bit more?
Absolutely. The principle of the natural judge is a fundamental legal guarantee that individuals should be tried by the court that has pre-established jurisdiction over their specific type of case according to the existing laws.
Right.
The argument being raised here is that the vast majority of individuals accused in connection with the January 8th events do not hold positions that grant them foro privilegiado,
Okay.
a special legal status that allows certain high-ranking officials to be tried directly by the Supreme Court. The contention is that these individuals should by law be tried in lower courts that typically handle such cases. A retired justice of the STF himself, Marco Aurelio Mello, has even been quoted expressing strong concern, stating that law no longer exists in Brazil in this context, reflecting a deep unease about the STF potentially exceeding its constitutional authority. By taking on cases that, according to this principle, belong in lower judicial bodies, it raises questions about the motivations behind the STF's insistence on trying these cases, whether it's truly in the interest of justice or potentially driven by other considerations.
It's quite a juxtaposition we've explored today, hasn't it? We started by delving into this ancient biblical understanding of African origins and then navigated the complexities of contemporary Brazilian legal and political battles.
It truly highlights how powerful narratives are, whether they are religious texts shaping identity across millennia or legal interpretations of events shaping the course of a nation, and how the understanding and interpretation of these narratives alongside the ever-present dynamics of power can have such far-reaching and significant consequences for individuals and societies.
So for you, our listener, what other hidden in plain sight narratives might be subtly influencing our understanding of the world around us, both in historical contexts and in the events unfolding today? And what critical questions should we be asking about the information we encounter, regardless of its source, whether it's ancient scripture or today's headlines?
Well, we really encourage you to delve deeper into both of these fascinating areas. Explore the biblical text concerning Africa for yourself, and continue to follow the ongoing developments within the Brazilian legal system by consulting a variety of news sources and analyses.
Maybe take some time to research some of those biblical figures we mentioned, or seek out diverse perspectives on the political situation in Brazil to form your own well-informed opinions.
Yeah,
It really is all about digging a little deeper and trying to connect the seemingly unconnected dots.
absolutely. There's always more to learn, and considering multiple viewpoints is crucial for a comprehensive understanding.
Well, that brings us to the close of our deep dive for today. We sincerely hope it's provided you with a valuable shortcut to being a little more informed and perhaps sparked a few aha moments along the way.
Oh,
Until our next exploration.
see them.
Bye.